Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1071st New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme joy of being your MC today for a conversation featuring RoseLee Goldberg, Ana Janevski, Zoe Leonard, Barry Schwabsky, and Lynne Tillman. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. RoseLee Goldberg, world-renowned art historian, critic, and curator, is founding director and chief curator of Performa. Launched in 2004 to create a highly visible public platform for contemporary art and performance by artists, Performa has changed public and academic perception of performance art with its citywide biennial, groundbreaking commissions, publications, and original arts broadcasting platform. Ana Janevski is a curator in the Department of Media and Performance at MoMA. She has organized more than 30 performances and has been involved in the programming of MoMA's Maria Jose and Henry Kravis studio, where she curated Joan Jonas' Good Night, Good Morning, the subject of today's conversation. New York-based artist Zoe Leonard balances rigorous conceptualism with a distinctly personal vision in her work, which merges photography, sculpture, and installation. Employing strategies of repetition, shifting perspectives, and a multitude of printing processes, Leonard's practice probes the politics of representation and display. Art critic and poet Barry Schwabsky writes for The Nation and is co-editor of International Reviews for Art Forum. His books include The Observer Effect on Contemporary Painting and the monograph Jillian Carnegie. His most recent collection of poetry is A Feeling of And. He is co-director of Sasve Summer Institute of Art and an editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. And our host today, Lynne Tillman, is a novelist, short story writer, and cultural critic. Her novels include Haunted Houses, Motion Sickness, Cast in Doubt, No Lease on Life, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, American Genius, a comedy, and Men and Apparitions. Her most recent work of nonfiction, Mother Care, was published in 2022. She is the recipient of a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship and the Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant. And she is a professor, writer in residence in the Department of English at the University of Albany. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Lynne to get us started.
Hello, hello everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be talking with these wonderful people and interesting people. And I wanted to start first with Ana, who is the curator of this rather unbelievably amazing exhibition. And if you haven't seen it yet, please go. And what I wanted to ask you is, because Joan Jonas keeps playing with particular ideas within her body of work, and the difficulty for a curator in figuring out how to place the work struck me as formidable. And one of the things that, because Joan does and then redoes and reinvents and then brings something back and then leaves it, and it goes on and on in terms of revising and redoing. It's kind of like a rebirth. But in the catalog essay, you say that nonetheless, it came to you that it would be best to have it chronological, which is the traditional exhibition form. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about the exigencies of curating this show and in relationship to the ordering of it.
Definitely. And thank you so much, Lynne, for this great question. And thank you, Brooklyn Rail, for having us, and good afternoon to everyone. I don't know, Chloe, if we can maybe start with the images. Actually, that's a great question, Lynne, and I think this was the biggest challenge of the exhibition, of organizing an exhibition of Joan Jonas that was supposed also to be retrospective, to give really an overview of the way she's working. And she's working, as you said, going really back and forth in the time, taking material from the past, putting it in the present, reorganizing certain work. And we can go, if we can stay at the first slide with the title, sorry, thank you. And in particular, what she does, she basically organizes her own work, because what Joan, among many things, why Joan is so important, it's also her way of thinking of what's the afterlife of performance. So when she starts doing performances, when she starts really to be in the space, she always altered the space in which she would do a performance. And throughout the time, she started doing installation based on previous performances of the sets, including props, including drawings, sound, and so on. So this translation from one medium to another. So you almost have the impression that the artist found a way of organizing herself. So what would you do? You can put these installations one next to each other and they work very well. This is also what has been done many times. But, we had the privilege really of spend some time with Joan. We, being in the same city, or have a time, enough time to really go very thoroughly through the material. And curatorially, I've been thinking a lot. We went through different phases, but what was pretty clear for me intuitively from the very beginning was chronology. And as you said, chronology is a very kind of a conventional way of thinking in organizing works, in organizing material. MoMA loves chronology. MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, loves chronology. Still, the collection is organized chronologically. And, and we know very well now that chronology is not linear. There are like many other ways of thinking about chronology. And definitely Joan's chronology is not linear. But when I start working on the model, I realized there's one thing that I wanted to really this show to show her process, to show her trajectory, to show her way of thinking, and to show how these elements are like repeating. Initially, the show, the title of the show was supposed to be, or like I was thinking to call it Reanimation, exactly because of this way of incorporating, previous material, props, films, and so on. And also Reanimation is the work that's in the collection. It's towards the end of the PowerPoint, so maybe we'll show it later, but because it's based, on a novel, which for Joan always literature is a starting point. She thinks about viewing devices. She thinks about nature and animal. She works with musician. She's incorporating a video from the 70s. So was Reanimation is perfect, but something was wrong with Reanimation. And Good Night, Good Morning is exactly doing what Reanimation does, but in a better way, because Good Night, Good Morning is a title of her work from 1976, when she every morning comes in front of the camera and says good morning, and every night she says good night, both in New York and in Cape Breton. And in 2006, and this is the work that you can see that is like turning the back to us, this structure, the minute theater structure, as Jones called them, she did the same thing. She repeated the same gesture. So I thought that this idea of good night, good morning, as a title, was already putting us in this idea of reusing something to the past in the present, because she says about herself, I'm an artist who work very much in the present. And also, I love this idea of the like, the repetition. Good night, good morning. It's like, it was for me, also the daily practice, the commitment to art that she has over 5 decades, because she's basically working daily. Her loft, there is no difference between like living or working zone. So the art and the way she's working is basically daily. And maybe to jump towards, because what you see what you see here is her work Wind. The projection is Wind, so it's her first work from 1968 that she does when she decides, to go into the space, and there are like mirrors are present. So this idea of changing the perception of the space. She's working with friends. The wind is so strong that she's performing for the camera with her friends. The wind is so strong, and the wind becomes the character. So there's the natural element. So I thought this work is her first work, and it really immediately put you in her interest. And maybe, Claire, we can go quickly through the yes. So like we included some of the elements. This is the dress or the hoop, because the circle and the hoop, you know, this view is also maybe thinking about curatorially, it was to, particularly for early works, her archives with the wallpapers, to ground it also the spectator, the audience, where things are happening. They're happening in New York. She puts audience on the roof. I remember seeing this photo in her studio, and I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. Then, and you can see there, like using some of the quotes, but yeah, it's and then we kind of, then you can see the articulation with the organic honey, which is like her first video work. But then from the video work, she starts doing performances, including video in the performance and organizing sets. So here you are like, see how she works. But everything, you know, I thought we were really trying not to be didactic, not to simplify. You know, this is Mirage, again, another amazing installation where, for example, she introduced just recently the recording of her performance in 2019 at Tate. We can go further. A classic of a Juniper Tree, the first work she doesn't use moving image. Then next one, for example, for this one, we really played with how to install it, because the Volcano Saga is a video. It's also an installation, and it used to be a performance. And we decided to show the video, adding elements that have never been really shown in relation to the video, or very rarely or never, like this, another more like installation of lines in the sand. And, you know, when you look at the photos of the performances, all these elements are in the performance. So there is a translation. So you like start to understand the woman, both works based on literature, the figure of the woman. And then we also, maybe next slide, allowed ourselves some special moments like this, which, you know, it was some like curatorial creativity together with Joan of, again, this wallpaper really grounding you where she is. She's in Cape Breton with all the props that she's using. And when you come here, you already saw some of the props in many of the work. And this is also the room dedicated to her as a teacher. Then we go, you know, following her path, her trip to Japan. Double Lunar Rabbit is the name of this piece, when she's using these special screens. And then we go into the last part of the show, when she's like in the most recent years dedicated more to ecology, environment. She works with children because they will go to inherit this world. Again, you have it, also she collaborates with the marine biologist David Gruber. So you see basically how it never stops. It's just like it's accumulative, and accumulative with all constantly new ideas, which I think it's also very fascinating about Joan. And then we go to the next slide, which is Reanimation, which I mentioned at the beginning, this work that she's based on a Halldor Laxness novel Under the Glacier that she filmed in Norway, and using this like incredible, this is what happened this last weekend here when she was performing, creating these very special effects with simple means. You know, these are like crystals with lights, and they create like some kind of a magic. And then we go out of the show, and this is also maybe to somehow summarizing how we were thinking, is the kites that she's been using since she, in the last maybe 15, 20 years, that she encountered kite makers in Japan and then in Vietnam. And for her, kites have a potential of flying in relation to the wind, the relation to children, to playfulness. And there is something very playful about her work. And I knew from the very beginning that wind has to be at the beginning and the kites at the end. And then, you know, when sometimes your intuitions are so strong, and then when you start working, you understand also why you had them. And I think it was also because, you know, the scholar Pamela Lee talked about the fact that she would not use for Joan the term retrospective, because retrospectives have something of like looking in the past and then like organizing it chronologically or thematically. She proposed the terms revision, because, you know, Joan is constantly revising. And I think with this exhibition wanted to propose the term loop for an exhibition, for a retrospective, because apart from the feedback loop that she uses in the 70s when she started, using the video camera, also this idea of the good night, good morning. So there is the wind at the beginning, the wind at the end, and there is like a loop. We start again, because you can always start again with Joan. So I think this is my answer to your question in a condensed way, but I'm happy to answer any question later.
Thank you. I think the next person is Barry. Is that right? Barry, you are uniquely gifted as a poet and as a critic. And I think poetry is very important to Joan's work, poetry and prose. And you bring to your reviewing of Joan, I think, that particular sense that she is both, I think of her as a very literary artist, because that is there is an underpinning of writing in her work, in her attitude toward her work. You could even think of the cones as something that could write, if you were a giant. The pointer part of it, the way one might point to a blackboard or some such. So I wonder, as a critic poet, what is your movement into her work? Where does that start for you, given how, as Ana was talking about, the diversity, the reanimation, the reuse of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's literature, there's sculpture, there's obviously performance, there's sound and music. I think that cinema is very important as a kind of background to her work, and in a way, like cinema or like opera, it's a total artwork that combines all senses and all media together into it. I was very, I was taken with what Ana was saying about temporality and about her decision to use a linear chronological structure in order to precisely to expose how the thinking that goes into and that comes out of the work is not linear and not chronological, but it's always going in these loops, and the loops are becoming ever wider and more inclusive, I think, as they go along. For me, as a writer, I just wrote an essay on her work that's in the current May issue of Artforum. And as soon as I finished the essay and it was out of my hands, all I could think about was all the things that I was so sorry to have to leave out. There's so many dimensions of her work. And when I was thinking about that, I was thinking that the thing that, and by the way, I also used a kind of linear chronological structure in that essay to try and illuminate what's not linear and chronological in the work, just as Ana did. But I realized that one of the main things that has struck me about her work really almost from the beginning of the time I've known it, and I've known Joan and her work since 1989, but one of the things that's most profoundly moved me that was impossible to bring into a museum exhibition in any direct way is her capacity to encompass vast space, or to make the vastness of space apparent. And one of the most amazing instances of that I remember was back in 1990 when she did a piece called Variations on a Scene at Wave Hill in the Bronx. And unfortunately, it seems like this piece was not very much documented, and I wasn't able to find any photographs that would really show my memories of it. But I think maybe those memories are kind of beyond the camera because there were so many things that were about things happening across big expanses of space that could never be encompassed by a single viewpoint. And another example of something that was incredibly moving to me was in 2004 when she did the piece that's called The Shape, the Scent, the Feel of Things up at the Dia Beacon. And that is represented in the show very beautifully. But there was a thing that happened in that piece that you just absolutely had to be present in the space when it happened. And that is, it took place in the lower level of Dia Beacon, which was formerly, I believe, the loading dock for whatever kind of factory building this was before it became an art space. And it's a very cavernous space with huge pillars and so on. And the piece concerns an episode in the life of the art historian Aby Warburg when he was hospitalized. And at the end of the piece, finally, Aby Warburg gets to leave the hospital, and he starts walking away from the audience toward the back of the space. And those vast garage doors open, and you've been there in the dark, watching this thing and suddenly all the light is flooding in from outside, and it's almost blinding you. And he walks out into the open space beyond the building. It was like really one of those transcendent moments, like in a Italian Baroque church where you look up at the ceiling and there's, Mary rising up into the heavens. It's going into a completely different dimension of space. And I think this fact that not only does her work take us into and out of and incorporate different times, but also many different spaces. They're very narrow spaces, very, condensed spaces, and then these very vast spaces. But which one is which switches. And it was so interesting to me last night when I went to see Joan perform outtakes at MoMA that she had incorporated an amazing poem by Emily Dickinson, which I think exactly summed it up. And so I wanted to read the poem, and probably many of you know it. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb, as sponges buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound, and they will differ if they do as syllable from sound. And I think this idea that, something this size can contain the whole world, that collapsing of scales is one of the most amazing things to happen constantly in her work. And so I think that in a way is really where I want to leave this.
Thank you, Barry. That's very interesting. I just learned recently that 80% of the brain is taken up by having, because we stand. Just keeping a human being standing and upright takes 80% of the brain, which is maybe why our species is really very stupid about many things. But next, I want to talk to RoseLee. RoseLee, your history of performance is kind of the history of performance. And I wanted to ask you, as a historian, and I know that Performa has supported Joan's work, been very critical to Joan's work. Sorry, I got distracted by the slide.
Yeah, can we take it off, actually?
And so I wanted to ask you how you, as a historian of performance, place Joan's work, how you see her in relationship to previous work, could be performance, could be gallery work, how you entered her work as a historian.
With pleasure. It's great to speak with you, Lynn, and everybody here today. First, Ana, thank you for the title. I'm so glad you didn't call it Reclamation. Good night, good morning talks about Joan in just total capacity. I mean, don't we all say good night, good morning? And it just feels as though she will be saying that infinitely, forever. It also is very optimistic, as she is. It's got a kind of ring to it that I just think talks about how every night and every morning we have to wake up and think how we can magically transform the world, which is what I think Joan does. I met Joan in the early 70s. I believe the first time was actually in Venice, and we were all sitting at the one cafe where everybody could fit into the one cafe on St. Mark's Church. And then we all moved to the St. Mark's Square. And in the evening, we all moved to the other side. That was the number of special viewers there for the preview days. Would it be like that today? Sadly, that's over. And I saw her in Rome again at another time when she was doing a beautiful piece that sort of stretched across the Tiber, and on and on. So to me, she's a presence that was always there. Coming to New York in the 70s, she describes also all the friends who were thinking together, working together, drinking together, maybe sleeping together. Everybody was deeply connected in the downtown New York. Below 14th Street, I like to say we owned it. Nobody dared come down there. And Joan talks very beautifully, actually, about how her transition from sculpture and poetry into performance, and does it in this wonderfully logical way where she talks about preparing for that move. I found that a lovely word, that she prepared by joining her friends, Trisha Brown, Yvonne, Carol Lee, also Deborah Hay she talks about. I remember going to a Deborah Hay performance in the 70s, and it was quite an experience. You did come out realizing that we were moving very differently from the ballet and the dance that a lot of us had studied through our childhoods. So Joan was there and talking very quiet, actually, not talking so much at that time. Well, so I thought. Maybe we were both being fairly quiet. So we were just getting to know each other. But I find it so easy to see her working with so many different parts of her brain. Thanks for that reference, Barry. I love this idea of the brain encompassing the entire world. I don't probably use that word very often, multidisciplinary. I think that we're all made up of so many parts. I think of artists who work in performances, visual artists who have a license to think in so many different ways, and Joan does that. The first time we did sit down to coffee, she passed a book to me about American Indian poetry. There was always something she was opening up for me that I had no idea about. Another time we met, she handed me a beautiful gift for my daughter, who was then about 2 years old. This sense of something that you didn't admit to, actually, in the art world of the 70s, having a child. You kept it very quiet, and Joan was there to be part of that in a very big way. So back to not really using this multidisciplinary term, because I think she is always all those things. And I think this exhibition, which another thought I had actually going through the exhibition, which she and Ana have put together in the most extraordinary way, is that we often used to say, you know, how come Joan hasn't had a major museum exhibition in the city? And I believe this is the first one. And another thought went through my head was, this is the best time to do it. This is the time to do it, with all that we've learned through Joan's sense of how to make installations, how to rethink performance, to think about all these elements of her work that stretch over such a long period of time. So I think I'm glad we waited. I'm glad we waited for Ana and Joan to put this together, because there's so much experience and understanding of all the elements of her work. And it goes back to another way that I always think of her, and maybe of some other great women that we admire, Yvonne Rainer, Tricia was another one, and so on, as forever radical. Joan is forever radical. None of that has lessened in any way. And if anything, to see this accumulation of ideas being put together in the space and into a catalog that is also extraordinary. I think the catalog is fantastic. As I'm often want to do, I sort of start at the back and flip the book, and I can't wait to see what comes before, because you realize that she's has been building these ideas over so much time. So to look at her work now is to see so much experience, so much knowledge, so much understanding, and she does not separate one medium from the other. She's a visual artist who thinks in many dimensions, and they're all present all the time. I don't see poetry as one step and video as another step, but as that she merges these, it just is her brain, the brain that Barry was describing. It's all those things all the time. Where else did I want to talk about? So with performance, the history that I wrote, which by the way, yesterday, on the 19th, was the 45th anniversary of the launch of the book at a party at the kitchen. And I actually had this great photo of Joan at the party. She looks gorgeous, but somehow we decided not to put it in today. And it's actually at a performance that Robert Longo did in for the party. And in the background is Hannah Wilkie and several other friends. And just the rough edge of the old days at the kitchen is in this photograph. But there's Joan, part of this world, as she still is today. So when I started Performa, it was really to pick up the mission of the book, which is to say artists have always made live performance. Visual artists think in many different disciplines. They look across disciplines. They look at the world through the same eyes, but through different different mediums and so on. So when I started Performa, it was to say, finally, once and for all, we're going to make a much bigger platform for the history of performance. I just got tired of it being treated as a sideshow. You know, you spend all the day wandering around the Venice Biennial, and you're totally exhausted, walking through all the pavilions and looking at lots of painting and sculpture. And then somebody says, oh, are you going to the performance tonight? And you're totally exhausted. And the last thing you want to do, actually want to sit down and have a glass of wine and not go to a performance, because it's just tiring. So another reason to start the Biennial was to say, we're going to give it this special treatment. You're going to have every reason to relax into performance and see something in a way that this extraordinary brain of an artist being realized in another dimension, which also brings the way that Joan approaches performance. I think she makes performance because she can't help it. It's the place where all these elements come together. It's where there's a necessity to put it into a public place. There's a necessity to put it in front of people. When we stand in front of somebody making a live performance, we're seduced and we're overwhelmed, and there's very little resistance, as opposed to, say, looking, and I love the work, say, at I don't know, any number of painters or abstract art, where we often feel, or those uninitiated might feel, they need a PhD in conceptual art to look at it. On the other hand, when you're looking at a live performance, you cannot put up barriers. You are part of that. So it was a conversation actually I had the other night with Anne Imhoff as well, which I found, it reminds me again of this necessity to make live performance, this idea that that's where the work really sings. That's where the work, you're able to bring everything from landscape to, emotion to intellectual diversions and richness and histories. And the level of Joan's thinking is, the layers, the levels is just profound and beautiful. So, and we learn every time we step into one of her works. So these are general impressions about how I've always thought of her work. And she just is forever radical. She keeps adding the next layer. You can't resist. She's bringing a complexity, and there's a sophistication to what she does that has been accumulated over 50 years. It's not like we look back and yes, we see a chronology, which we must do, but we see a building of all these layers, of these sediments that are just being improved upon and elevated. I think actually 21st century was ready for Joan's exhibition at MoMA. Let's remember that the projections are much larger than anything we would do. That entrance with the wind, I've never seen the wind projected at that scale. That would not have been shown at that size. I don't believe in it. She originally made it in the late 60s. So we're looking at everything that's come to support the current work, which is, we're all better trained to look at performance. We're all better accomplished and accustomed to looking at performance in a museum. So again, I think the world's been waiting, this museum world has been waiting for this level of thinking about Joan's work. I have seen smaller exhibitions before, but they somehow get put into a dark corner with, video and stuff, and it just never had the impact, whereas Ana gave it its own landscape. You sort of walk around with a lot of space around you, so that was wonderful. So back to Performa. So indeed, she's been, for me, a constant. Whenever we could, we've added a current work or a new work. So I just wanted to take you through a few of those, if we can see the slides. One is with Clifford Owen that we did at Studio Museum in Harlem. And that's the first slide. It's Joan, again, in her amazing capacity she's just such a good sport. She'll do anything, try anything. And this was a piece that Clifford Owen did at the Studio Museum for our very first biennial in 2005 that he called Intimate Performances for One. It was called Studio Visits. He basically asked Joan to use his body as a drawing tool. So you see her, this delicate, very amazingly athletic woman moving Clifford around over her papers and somehow using his feet. You'll see if you look carefully at his sneaker, he has some kind of drawing, some kind of crayon attached to his feet and his fingers. So she's actually using him to make these drawings, which was a lot of fun. And it was a direct work about interfacing two artists in a space, having a studio visit. The next work we did in 2000, in our next biennial, was reading Dante. No, actually it was, yes, reading Dante. A wonderful piece where she takes us through Dante, the Divine Comedy, and puts it into a 21st century mode. And again, I'm astonished always by this work at the emphasis on visual spectacle that somehow comes across in these beautiful photographs. So if we can see the next image, again, these different scales that she's working with, these different ways that she incorporates other people. There's just so much collaborative energy that comes through in her work. So many pictures that she's construing. She talks about her obsession with, the Italian Renaissance, with space, with constructing spaces where people can be scaled to fit the square of the image. And how she understands those two things, both 3D and 2D, as a body in space, as the dancer, the performer, and as somebody who paints and draws as she does. So she has these multiple ways of reading space and putting her own body into space, which again, I always find to be an expression of this very, very sensitive and sophisticated understanding of different media, you know, her obsession with Giacometti versus obsession with drawing versus obsession with dancers and so on. So we see all those layers constantly at work. And then in this case, again, her fascination in reanimation that starts to bring us into the world of Icelandic writer Halldór Laxness. If any of you've been to Iceland and read Laxness' work, Joan somehow brings this momentous sense of another world into a performance space that's actually quite extraordinary. So yes, that's where I will leave us in this wonderland that Joan constantly creates. And we haven't even begun to talk about what her other collaborators have brought to the mood that she constructs, as she's been doing at MoMA all this month with other collaborators, like her extraordinary relationship. And I'd almost say love affair, but I don't mean it in that sense. I just mean a real love between her and Jason Moran is extraordinary and beautiful to behold. So thank you, Ana. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, everyone, for this sense of her being with us, so present, and actually moving between MoMA and the Drawing Center to see her drawings. I could carry on about how I just always fall in love with her all over again when I see those drawings and see her hand at work on paper. So that's just some general responses.
Thank you, RoseLee. I also think that the influence of John Cage and the improvisatory and obviously chance has also, it's deeply embedded in Joan's work. And I think one of the reasons that she is so adept at working with others is because of that background of allowing things to happen, to have a general idea or a script, but of what could happen or should happen. There's always space for the unexpected. And I think one of the reasons watching a performance of hers is so captivating is because you are in that moment when anything might happen. And I think she's so gifted in that way and generous. And that's part of, let's say, in her performance with Jason Moran, the back and forth is very much like jazz. They are listening to each other and they are responding to each other. Now, Zoe Leonard, who took photographs of the studio, very beautiful photographs of the studio. I wanted Zoe to talk to you a little bit about the studio. Like many of you, I've done many studio visits, and walking into each one with the artist standing there, it always feels like a kind of invasion into this space, which is precious and fragile also to the artist. And the photographs of Joan's studio, and as Ana said, it's also her living space, has a kind of it feels like everything that she puts into her work is also around her all the time. And I know artists who will never put their work up and artists who only put their work up in their studios. And I wondered how you thought about the studio and when you were your own studio and others, and when you were photographing Joan's studio, what was most present to you? What was most important?
Thank you, Lynn, for that question. It's so great listening to everybody, all of these beautiful ideas. forever radical. Yeah, Lynn, it's when Ana Janevski invited me to take these photographs for the book in relation to the, to Good Night, Good Morning at MoMA, I think I answered yes before. Actually, can we keep those on the first slide and then we'll look at them together? I'm going to pause and we can look at them and then I'll talk a little more. So I think I answered yes before Anna's email had even fully arrived in my inbox. I was so thrilled at the chance to do this. I came to Joan's work kind of late. I had seen here and there some films of documentation of the early performances, Wind and Delay, and I'd seen a couple of installations. But it was when, I think in 2005 or 2006, I saw The Shape, the Scent, the Feel of Things up at DIA. And I was just so blown away by the kind of layering and the complexity and the use of this tremendous amount of space, and how there was myth, there was song, there was music. And I loved it so much that I think I went back and saw like every single performance. I just kept going back up to DIA. And then I think another important touchstone for me, I've seen many performances since then, but the show at Gavin Brown in 2017, where there was one floor with the props laid out on the table. And the way that that show does something which I think is paralleled in the current show at MoMA, which was it clarified something about Joan's process without reducing it or kind of bleeding it of its sense of liveness. But having all those props laid out on the table made me very curious about how Joan lives among these objects and how that all how that all exists within Joan's work and Joan's life. So I was very lucky to be invited in to photograph, and Joan was tremendously generous with me. I went once a week for several months to the studio in New York, and then was lucky enough to be able to go for 4 or 5 days up to Cape Breton. And every time Joan in New York, Joan would greet me at the elevator door with Ozu and would warn me that Ozu might bite me, which Ozu did most weeks. Didn't hurt at all. But Joan would always ask the same thing, like, do you want me to set something up for you? And I would say, well, if you want to show me anything, I would love that, but I'm also happy to just poke around. And she would just say, well, great, then you poke around. And she would go do what she was doing and would just let me have free reign of the loft. So I was able to just kind of look and spend hours looking and photographing and coming back and looking again. And because she had agreed to let me come multiple times, there wasn't that kind of pressure to like come in and get it all at once. And I was able to just sort of absorb it and really, just soak in this atmosphere. Maybe we could look at the photographs now, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the observations that I think will answer your question, Lynn. So shall we look at them? Yeah, that's the last one. And actually, the invitation was to photograph the studios, not to photograph Joan. So I took very few photographs of Joan. Occasionally, I would ask her if she would mind if I took a snapshot. And this last one was during a walk on the beach, obviously, which just I love for the relationship with her and Ozu. But yeah, a couple of things came really clear to me in the studio visits, or the things that struck out to me through looking at all of these objects that Joan has around her. Is there this kind of dynamic way that they move from being props to being parts of everyday life? And it's really, it's not always clear where that line is, or if that line is important or not. There are animals everywhere, many different kinds of birds, fish, dogs, wolves, squirrels. But there are also stones and rocks and bones. But there are also many objects that are made by people. There are textiles and puppets and paperweights and ceramics and masks. And many of the images of animals are made by people. They're little sculptures or figurines or embroideries. And it really struck me that one of the things about Joan's work that I find most moving is that human culture is incorporated as part of nature, not as something separate from it or counter to it. So it's a kind of, it gets away from the binary of like humans and nature. It's really humans as part of nature, and how there's this interspecies relationship going on that we don't take good care of, but we are so violent towards nature because we constantly separate ourselves from it. And Joan proposes a world where we accept ourselves as part of nature, and more in an integrated world. The other thing that I thought about a lot is this presence of so many different kinds of canines, that there are always dogs. There are dogs always, Joan's pets, who play a huge role. Sappho, Xena, and Ozu are in all of the work. And there are images, drawings, photographs of them, you know, scattered throughout the loft. And Ozu is always present. But there are also numerous images of coyotes and wolves and wild dogs. And I started to think about how Joan's work sort of acts as a portal between different aspects of life that are parallel. And again, things that we often categorize as separate, but in Joan's work, they're brought together and shown to be connected states: interior and exterior, the domestic and the wild, stillness and movement. There's this kind of porousness in the work. And in Cape Breton, especially, in the nature of that house where Joan works, and with doors out to this huge deck, the kind of porousness between inside and outside, between the domestic and the wild, between the sea and the sky, between the quiet and the noisy. All of these things feel incredibly integrated and dynamic and active. So I think that those were really the observations that I came away with. And I feel just, I guess, incredibly privileged to have been invited, and that Joan allowed me to move so freely through her spaces, and to observe all of these incredible objects and how they they also constantly move around the house. There's like the seaweed is here, then the seaweed is there. Things come inside and outside. It was a really, and I don't say this lightly, it was incredibly inspiring. I think Joan's practice, the freedom that she gives herself within it, is incredibly, incredibly inspiring, as is the way in which Joan collaborates, as you pointed to, RoseLee, just over many, many years, these collaborations that develop. It was just, it felt like a very rejuvenating and inspiring and kind of heartening experience to be near all of this creative energy and this kind of dynamic intelligence, right? Like a constantly moving creative intelligence that is so in tune with interior and exterior worlds and so observant of the world around her. It's really, I feel really very, very lucky, and I hope to go back.
So, sorry, do you want to read the poem after we've done everything else?
I'm happy to do it whenever. I think Chloe mentioned that usually on the Rail talks, it's used to close, but I'm happy to read it now if that feels better.
That's up to you. I just wasn't sure. I do have a general question, and maybe after that. And looking at Joan's work, I wish I were a phenomenologist, because I think one of the critical aspects of her work is experience. And it is, I think, one of the reasons it can be difficult to characterize is not just the different elements and the revisiting and the revising, it is so much an experience to look at her work. And I think, in a way, I think it is staged in order to be an experience. And it also, at the same time, is an experience because you've got this movement among people or objects. And so the issue of improvisation and her allowance of that makes for, I think, a very complicated viewing situation. When it's an installation, you're looking at different objects, and sometimes we read something like a sentence, and if we're Japanese, say, we read it in the opposite way, that sentence. And I think part of the difficulty that Joan's work has received, or is critical reception or no reception, is because it's experiential. And I wondered if any of you would like to talk about that, as her work as an experience.
Maybe I can start, as I will have also to leave. And that's another great point, Lynn, because I think one of the call it concerns, it was also, how the audience can take so much, for example, into her exhibition. And because what Joan creates are these, like, this collapse of scales, like it's someone says it's like the world in the world in the world in the world, something that keeps like growing. But in I think that there is something about Joan in this experience that she gives you in a way, and one thing that I wanted to also mention in terms, for example, like she's an incredible improviser within a structure, as most improvisations are. And, because the idea of the chronology not only came from, the chronology as a curatorial art historical tool, but it also came from Joan herself, because her first, really most extensive book from her Berkeley show in 1983, which the book came after the show, she edited it with Douglas Crimp. The material is all organized chronologically. And there is something about, and she describes together with Douglas Crimp, every single work. So this experience, for example, for me and my colleagues, when we had this book for the first time, and to read these descriptions, which can be also dry, but there was something very illuminating about it. And to read and to understand that she organized this chronologically after the fact, that she wrote the scripts for the works after the fact. So the scripts are kind of a record, which is also like thinking, you know, of the experience, make again her very, very avant-garde and very unique. Because, you know, there is like the performance experience, your experience as the audience, the different medium that you're encountering. And I think that she has her way of organizing it. And I think also what I found extremely beautiful, and she lives with space, because in a way it's not always important to understand everything, to see everything, to capture everything, because that's impossible. It's like the brain in the world, you know, as much there is an impossibility of that I think in nowadays in this, you know, capitalist system, we want to fix things, to understand things, to categorize things, and to be able then, you know, to think also of, about the future, what will stay, how we will conserve. And she's always elusive in that. She's very organized, but elusive, as in a way life is, because as much you control, there is always the part that would not be under your control. So I think that's why she's also so unique. And that's why, for example, her reception in Europe was very different than the reception in the United States. She has so many shows in Europe, so many books. And in New York, she had a show in 2003 at the Queens Museum, curated by Valerie Smith, that was called 5 Works. And that was the only institutional show before MoMA. And I think it was because of this, all of this, what I'm saying, which is what RoseLee was saying, very contemporary and very real. And that's how life is. But if I think the tendency in art is to trying to find certain academic boxes. And I think she is the kind of most, not even elusive, she creates ecosystems. This is what exactly Zoe was talking about. You know, she's like thinks about nature in relation to humans, to the dog, the children and the adults. There is no hierarchy. And also in the way her installations are constructed, we have like 3 loans in the entire show. It's all coming from her studio. It's all has to rebuild. So it's this ecosystem that she's building, and it's like it's a parallel system, and big systems don't like always parallel systems. So there is a moment when finally it's embraced, but it still will be difficult to institutionalize it as, for example, some artistic form will be. So it's like it's you know, it's a begin again. It never really stops, and that's, I think, what makes her so unique and so contemporary.
Thank you. Now, are we to open this up to the audience, or is there a conversation among the discussants? I wasn't sure where we go from here.
Yeah, so if anybody else wants to respond to what Ana just said, please feel free to. Does anyone else have anything you want to add there? Okay, no pressure. We have a few audience questions, so I'll start with those. I believe the first question is going to be from Fong. Fong, I think while we're waiting for Fong here, I'm going to turn to GE's question. GE's wondering what you all think Joan would be if she hadn't been an artist.
She says she's an artist, so
perhaps perhaps she'd work in a shelter for animals.
I think that the only way that she wouldn't be an artist if she had passed away before adulthood. I think she had no other fate but to be an artist. And I don't think it was not one that she came to in a direct way. I think she gathered a lot of things into herself before coming to think of herself as an artist. I mean, she studied art history, she studied art, but then she also lived another kind of life that was sort of tangential to art. We were talking to her the other day, and she was recollecting how at an early stage she was going to workshops with choreographers like Yvonne Rainer and Deborah Hay, and trying to understand their ways of movement, and that gave her to understand that she wasn't a dancer, but there were things that she got from that went into her art. So it's also the question of how you go through life and take on things that are usable, but that don't define you.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with Barry that I think Joan, I can't imagine Joan is an artist. And I think she is one of a number of artists who really changed what that definition means. And I think it's precisely about this question of fixity, that the work doesn't just arrive, not just, but it doesn't arrive as like a finished painting or a finished sculpture, a thing in space that is fully defined. It constantly has this reanimation of itself, or reusing and movement. As Ana was saying earlier, how the exhibition begins with the wind and ends with the kites, because it's this and Joan said something in the performance the other night. There was a talk afterwards between Ana and Joan, and she said, she was talking about the wind and how much she loves the wind, and how in Cape Breton, whenever a windstorm is coming, she like grabs all her stuff and goes out on the deck and starts like playing with like paper and instruments. There's this sense of movement and instability as being productive, rather than as something to be fixed and finalized and made into an object or product. And maybe, Lynn, this might get to some of your questions of like why the work wasn't as well known, or why there hadn't been a museum exhibition, because it didn't have that kind of commodity aspect to it, where it's like, oh, here's the thing and you can buy it and take it home. It's experiential. And for me, why the MoMA show works so beautifully is that it doesn't try to fix it in space in that way. It clarifies it, but it begins, you have that first room with the wind and the title, Good Night, Good Morning, which immediately imply movement and continuity and change. And then you walk right towards the mirrors. So as soon as you enter the first room, you're already seeing this destabilized image and yourself as part of it. So I think the way that the show was curated and presented didn't try to kind of commodify or fix Joan's work. So in that way, not only is she an artist, but I think is one of a number of people. John Cage, you mentioned, is another, but who really expanded the idea of what an artist is, and that art is a whole way of thinking. It's a whole process. It's a way of living and being, and it's a conversation. It's a whole way of engaging with the world and inviting other people to engage with you. Yeah.
Also, I just want to pick up on that very title, Good Night, Good Morning, is so telling, because if the title had been Good Morning, Good Night, then you would have the sense of a cycle completed and a closure. But by starting with Good Night and then ending with Good Morning, it reminds us that the cycle continues. It's not at an end. It's always coming to another beginning.
Going back to this idea about experience, I think one of the things that interested me, I think Ana has left, in the way the show was curated with Joan's help, is that it's an approach toward figuring out how to install something that is and might have been ephemeral and disappeared. And that was very compelling to me also, to make installations out of objects or elements that were in a piece that might have been or was a performance. And I think that's important because I think one of the other reasons that performance was put, as RoseLee was talking about, to the side, was because of the ephemeral. Now that's going to remain important to performance, but in terms of legacy and how things go on, I think one of the things about this show is that it has figured out a way to present this work.
Thank you all so much for those answers, and thank you for that question, GE. The last question today is going to be from Fong. Fong, I'm going to give you the chance to unmute.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you so much, Zoe, Barry. Yeah, I remember seeing Mirror piece that was made in 1969, and it was a year after Tet Offensive. And I was talking to my brother, and it came to me so clearly how Joan is one of the artists who I really want, the reason I came to New York for. And it still remains that day to this day, because you can't really give a label to what she does. And when you say about experiential, and Barry mentioned about the cycle that is remaining to be moving along, the cosmic totality, I would say. And it just, it's not just about process or social, political, everything else that she was able to absorb. I also think of the psychology of spectatorship in the mirror. Her use of mirror is so interesting to me. There's, of course, aspect of poetry is always very important in her work, as you all talk about. But I also think about fable. There's a component of mythology and fable, and I can't help but to think of, you probably remember that great lectures that Italo Calvino gave at Harvard, but he never completed. But his widow decided to publish it anyway. Then you remember it's called Six Memos for the Next Millennium. Might have been published in 88, I think. And the first was about likeness. And when I think about Joan, I think of likeness, because that mirror piece reminds me so much of what had been described, her ability to be so agile, to surrender to things, to expose to things, like what Toni Morrison say, when you surrender to the wind, you can ride it. And I think that is the most important thing about her ability to do so, because in likeness, there's recall of the myth of Perseus, who's able to slay the head of Medusa. For those who previously had looked directly in her gaze, turned to stone. But unlike them all, he was able to borrow the shield of the goddess of wisdom, Athena, by looking at indirect reflection, which on the mirror of the shield, he was able to achieve his goal. But and then there's also this aspect of Perseus, who, when he slayed the head of Medusa, the blood fed right into earth-born Pegasus. So when I think about Joan, I think of both. I think about Pegasus and I think about Perseus. And she's able to be so agile. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, you can, I'm asking you now, because the relationship, just because our beloved Richard Serra had passed away recently, that relationship I find is compelling, because Richard gone to Yale to study with Al Hale, with Neil Welliver as a painter. And Joan went to Columbia Graduate School as a sculptor, studied with Peter Agostini, with Sydney guys, and then they both gave up their initial, goal, and they met. I think that relationship is fruitful. And I also want to mention Living Theater, Lynn, that very implicit political activism of Judith Molina and Julian Beck. So I want to see how did that absorb into her own ability. I mean, she's like a rice sponge. She's, I think, no, seriously, I admire so much Lynn at this stage of her career, having a retrospective moment, and the openness is just remarkable, and the sense of curiosity is unmatched. So I don't know how she does it all,
She said, Joan said when I did a conversation with her for Freeze, she said, when I said, do you call it a retrospective? She said, no, it's a survey, because not everything I've done is there. So yes, I think all of those influences, the living theater, Richard Foreman, the way Richard used objects in his staging, I think may have influenced her. Of course, Cage and others.
Jack
to
Smith.
absorb.
Can I interrupt and say
Yeah.
Jack Smith?
Yes.
Jack Smith,
yes.
Flaming Creature. Yes.
Yeah. Another thing, well, I was lucky enough to see one performance in the late 70s before he stopped. And it was extraordinary. He was so slow in his movements. You felt time, he was trying to stop time. And yes, I think Joan absorbed many, many things. And out of that, she maybe did a synthesis, and then a new thesis grew.
Yeah. Well, I love what she said. I gave up making sculpture and I walk into the space. That's like the ultimate summation of being fearless, surrender to in that space. And I think that's exactly the most important inspiration for me at what I do with the rail. And I hope my young team find it equally inspiring. So it's not exactly a question. I'm sure we can say more things about Joan. But for those of you who haven't seen it, please make the effort to see the show. And it's worth multiple visits, I would say. Yeah.
May I just?
Thank you.
But and Zoe is going to read a poem now.
Yeah. Now I'm going to pass the mic over to Zoe Leonard, who's going to close us out with a reading today, but not without saying thank you so much to all of you for this incredibly brilliant conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks to everybody, and thank you for having us. And actually, this sort of follows exactly on what you were just talking about, Fong and Lynn, about how Joan so often incorporates other work in her work: poetry, literature, folk tales, song, mythology. There's this incredible appreciation of the field of kind of human cultural production. There's so much love and attention to all of these other already existing art forms that I think comes through in her work. And in her performance of Outtakes, which I actually just saw on Sunday, she read this poem by Mahmoud Darwish, which I'll read for you now. It's called Think of Others. As you prepare your breakfast, think of others. Do not forget the pigeon's food. As you conduct your wars, think of others. Do not forget those who seek peace. As you pay your water bill, think of others, those who are nursed by clouds. As you return home to your home, think of others. Do not forget the people of the camps. As you sleep and count the stars, think of others, those who have nowhere to sleep. As you liberate yourself in metaphor, think of others, those who have lost the right to speak. As you think of others far away, think of yourself. Say, if only I were a candle in the dark.
That was so beautiful, Zoe. Thank you so much for closing us out with that reading today. And thank you so much, RoseLee. Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Ana, for today's incredibly generous dialogue. It was such a pleasure to hear you all talk about Joan's work on the occasion of Good Night, Good Morning. And I do hope everyone has the chance to see the show while it's on at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York. At the Rail, we also would like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our new social environment program and make conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive on YouTube, where this video will be posted shortly. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years. A donation directly supports our work. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Raymond Foy, Andrew Lampert, and Charles Stein on the occasion of Jordan Belson Hidden Formations at Matthew Marks Gallery in New York. And with that, I'm going to throw open the mics and give everyone the chance to say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for being here today. And thank you again to everyone for your conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Barry. Thank you. Thank you, Joan.
Great meeting. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you so much, Joan.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Joan.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Fawn.
you,
Joan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank
Thank you for the poll, the poll.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Long live Joan Jonas. Long live Joan Jonas.